Welcome to the Deer Society Podcast. Here's your host, Brian Lemke.
Well, hey guys, welcome to the Deer Society Podcast, episode number 3. Today we have Mike Ducart with myself, Brian Lemke, and we are joined by the world-renowned Klaus Lebrecht with Antlers by Klaus. And Klaus has done lots of things from taxidermy to replicating some of the largest deer that we know to have existed in history. So, Klaus, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Today we're going to be talking about big bucks and some of the biggest bucks really in history. Klaus brought with him today a superior deer that has just kind of become known here recently. So I want to talk a lot about that. But let's start off, Klaus. Let's tell everybody, what do you do? How did you get into this business, and really, how did you get started?
Well, I'll try to give you the shortest answer I can. Many years ago, before the whole whitetail craze, grew, I got a book called Greatest Whitetails by Robert Rogers. And I wasn't even a hunter. I don't know if it was gifted to me or how I even got the book. But in there was the Kent Petrie head from the state of Montana. And it looked like a pitchfork, 2 pitchforks, because the beams curved up. And I just became fascinated with deer and deer antlers. I started deer hunting, and North American Whitetail had just put some of their stuff on the newsstand at Fleet Farm, of all places. I found it, got the first issue, and long story short, I got hooked on monster deer, knowing what locals shot and then seeing world-class deer. I couldn't believe the size and the beauty of those deer that were featured on the covers. And so a long lifetime fascination, obsession, whatever you want to call it, addiction, started with all of that. And I was a taxidermist, became a taxidermist shortly thereafter, and I was fascinated with big deer antlers, but I never could afford what people were paying for them. The collectors at the times, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 were very common figures being paid for significant deer antlers. And the art of replicating deer antlers was in its infancy. It had stolen from the bronze casting world of how to, make a sculpture and cast it in a lost wax system. And that procedure was then applied basically by some artisans to the antler replicating techniques. So the materials and things being used at that time were very, very new. They weren't designed for that process. They were designed for other things. And so I met a gentleman by the name of Mike Gillis, who later on offered me an opportunity to go to a workshop of his and learn the process. And so that's what I did, and I started replicating deer. And at that time, we were at probably the highest level of collecting being done in the United States with regards to people buying deer antlers, collectors. There was many of them. And in order for them to consummate their deal, they had to provide, in most cases, the hunter or the owner of the original antlers that they were going to purchase with a copy. Otherwise, the deal wouldn't be made. They wouldn't want to sell the antlers. And so, long story short, I learned the art of replicating. I perfected many of the problems with it that made them look fake or synthetic. And we just skyrocketed to the top very shortly as far as our services being acquired to make these deals come through. So that's a long, I could expound on that many times over, but that's a very fast version of a long story.
Good deal. Yeah. And, over those years, you've been able to replicate some of the biggest deer that we know of. Tell me about some of those really big deer you've had your hands on and replicated some of, the biggest deer ever, world records. Tell me about some of those.
Well, there's so many of them. The obvious, the Jordan Breen, the Hole in the Horn, Del Austin, the icons out there of that still stand today as the records in most instances. Of course, Mossy Horns has been beat now a few times over, but they're iconic, and they're much like the Elvis Presley and the Marilyn Monroes of entertainment. They're words that most people can look at, or words to the antlers that most people recognize, and probably the most infamous of all is the hole in the horn. It's just the name, a hole in the horn, and the size and its history, and the long investigation to finally figure out how that hole actually got there was an interesting story of all the successive years of people coming forth and adding to the story, and finally resolving what caused the hole in the horn, buck. So interesting things, but there's so many state records we've done. Recently, the Stephen Tucker buck that was harvested in Tennessee, I believe, was one we just did for Stephen here a little over a year ago. So yeah, we end up usually getting most of the new stuff, that's harvested, and we have a reputation for doing that kind of high quality work that people are looking for.
What goes into that process of replication? I mean, how long does it typically take to replicate a rack? And walk us through what that process is like.
Well, we've from doing it over 30 years now, we've got it down to a science where it goes very quickly. But still, we receive the antlers, clean up the skull cap, all the gristle and anything that might be still there, and then mount it on a stand and start applying a casting rubber to it. They're silicone-based products, and we start to form a rubber mold or impression of the antlers. And so there's a two-step process to molding it, where you build a mold that is taking all the detail and the impression of the antler, and then you build another mold around that mold, which is rubber, and that's out of fiberglass or other materials that we can use that keep that mold in place and maintain the integrity of the shape of the antler and so forth. So you're building a mold actually twice of the antler, but for two different reasons. And the secondary, or what we call the mother mold, or the jacket, which covers the internal mold, it's put together with just different pieces of fiberglass and so forth. So it is a lengthy process, and of course, the more complex the antlers are, the more complex the mold becomes. One buck we did a number of years ago, it scored 651, I believe, SCI score, non-typical, and it had 43 brow tines, if you can imagine. Wow. It just came out like a root system. And I handed it to my son, who's our chief molder, and I said, "This is yours. You do it." And he couldn't wait to dive in. He loved the challenge. But it was a month's project to make a mold of that thing. Wow. And, all those parts have to come out. They have to come apart. So the real art of knowing how to mold is to envision the mold completed before you begin it. Because if you don't do that, you'll end up deadlocking yourself and not getting it apart. It will not come apart. And you've got to just kind of say, okay, if I pull this way, pull that way, bring this down here, loop that up around there, and you have to figure a pathway to, disassemble that mold. And that's kind of the real challenge of molding things like that.
Crazy. Well, once you get that molded, it comes out as a white chalk. Well, then how do you get it to look exactly like those antlers? Because I'm looking up at this one. This is a real rack here, correct?
No, that's a reproduction.
Oh, see, that just blows my mind. So
yeah.
I'm looking at this thing and I'm seeing the little dark spots, that are imperfections. And so how do you get that, make it so imperfect to look perfect, I guess?
Well, in this instance here, I had the originals as I painted the reproduction, and that's kind of the thing that our company has done that sets us aside from most out there. Most can build a mold. People have talents to build a mold, to make a reproduction, but then to take it to that final level of painting it so it looks authentic and, it fool most people. That's where most guys, don't have that ability to do that. And it's just studying the texture of the paint and where it's applied and where it's not applied, and using small brushes. This piece behind me here took me 2 full days to paint. It's not and a lot of guys thought, well, you have a bucket called antler stain, you stick your brush in and you smear it on and magic, it looks like an antler. It doesn't work that way. It's a very slow, tedious process of, applying the right colors in the right places and mimicking what nature has done, through whatever that deer came in contact with, the trees, the blood that dried on its antlers from shedding its velvet, all the different factors that color the antlers up.
Yeah, it's an art, and you really are an artist, and that's what really comes through. I've held quite a few, reproductions that you've done, and I can tell you that I cannot tell the difference. You look up there, and just like Mike said, you would think that's a real rack. Everything from obviously the mold, but the painting. And even the weight of these antlers now. I mean, you pick the thing up and there's not a difference. It's not light. It doesn't feel fake. It feels real.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you look at that one, and this is what got me, is you can see where the deer would rub. You're going to have that white shine, and it looks like it actually happened on a real antler. And then you look at the little details where you can tell they can't get that tree contour into that spot, so there's a little dark patch there, and that's all in there. It's just, it just looks. I thought it was the real one.
No, it's complimentary to say that. Yeah, it gets to be like an obsession again, where how close to the real thing can we take it? And you mentioned the weight, and we worked on that for a number of years because the resins out there. Resins are very much like bubble gum. There's thousands of flavors, thousands of things out there, types of resins you can use. And in the area of polyurethanes, there's a endless choice of polyurethane resins being made by various companies. And we searched long and hard to find the one that we use. And then we also have things that we add to it to achieve a low level of flexibility, so you don't have this rubbery antler feel as they were years ago, and then also to mimic the weight, so we can actually get them right down to the ounce, where you put them on a digital scale and weigh both pieces, and they weigh identical. So when a person handles it, I always found it interesting because guys would say, well, they're lightweight, and I thought, well, what difference does it make when you put it on the wall? But just that short period of time of them carrying it from wherever, they get it from us or out of a box and putting it on the wall, they want that realism, Absolutely. So as unimportant as it may seem, it was important that we come up with something that made them as close to the weight as we could. Our goal was basically, can we recreate an antler that is basically capable of fooling people? Get it that close, and I think we did.
Yeah. Well, you obviously had us fooled here. Since we've got into it, this buck behind you here, let's talk about that. And for you guys that are just listening, Klaus brought with him today a set of very special sheds, and they're actually mounted on a skull right now. These are reproductions that you just finished. Tell us a little bit about this deer, these sheds, where they're from, and how you got your hands on them.
Well, that's an interesting story. Good friend of mine, Jay Fish, that many people know from the controversial Johnny King buck and that whole battle that has gone on over that deer. He had purchased this set of sheds from a buyer in Ohio by the name of Keith Snyder. And Keith had acquired them from a lady who actually harvested this deer a year after the sheds were found. And the deer had gone downhill in score because instead of being a 5x5, he actually was a 4x5 and threw a kicker out the G2 on the right side, I believe. And so she hunted this buck and harvested it. And she found one shed, the smaller side, the right side, and her niece, I believe, found the left side. So she had the sheds, and I'm not quite sure on the story how Keith had found out about this deer, but he had inquired about it and found out there were sheds. So he ended up buying the harvested buck and also the sheds off the deer from a girl. Her name was Andrea Moffett. And that's the name of the deer. Now, the interesting thing is it comes from the state of Indiana, which is not typically known as a producer of large whitetails. And we're seeing this kind of across the nation. We're seeing the southern states, eastern states come on with big deer all of a sudden. That used to always be kind of the Midwest that produced the big monsters. And for whatever reason, if it's genetics or the intensive efforts to let the deer grow, if that's making the difference, I don't know what all factors into that, but we are seeing that movement in trophy antlers, that they're coming from states that we usually didn't expect them to come from. So this behind me is the world record 5x5 in any category, whether it was harvested, whatever you want to assign to it. It's the biggest 10-pointer in the world, and set up behind me as it is, it would score 209 and 5/8 inches.
Wow.
So and the big side is 99 and 2/8 inches. And these just got scored by the North American Shed Club. Buckmaster scored it, and the Northwestern Big Buck Club, which is more the eastern area, I think has a scoring club, and they score big antlers. So it is the biggest 5x5 ever grown on the planet. So it's big.
Unbelievable. So yeah, you guys are looking at the largest 5x5 in the world, hanging right up there, and it is impressive. So these sheds were picked up what year?
Last year.
Just last year?
I believe 17. Yes, I believe she harvested. No, I'm sorry, take that back. I think the sheds were picked up in 16, and I believe she harvested the buck in 17. But my facts might not be 100% on that. So
okay, awesome.
It was very current.
Very, very cool. Yeah. Unbelievable to look at a deer of that caliber. When you look up there, I mean, there's a lot of big deer around the Deer Society office here, and you see a lot of our guys have shot really big deer, and you look at something like this, and Mike, you said it, I mean, it almost looks like an elk frame.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, I walk in the office every day, and we have our consumer show display sitting right outside the office area, and there's 5 200-inch plus bucks on there. And when he brought this in and I looked at it, and I was just amazed. I mean, the bases on that thing, they really are. They have the feel of an elk. They're just huge. Just the mass and the width of it is it's amazing if you see it in real life.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It seems like, you hear so many stories of deer that pop up, or there's a rack that pops up in Ohio or Illinois, and it can be from way back in the day. How often do you see, these racks from the past just kind of showing up now? And what do you think is still out there? I mean, do you think somewhere out there there's something, a 5x5 that's bigger than that could be in somebody's basement or?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I've had a very privileged position in the deer world, learning and knowing a lot of what's going on behind the scenes, collectors calling me with things and people with information of deer. A good example of what you're talking about right now just happened a year ago. A gentleman bought a rack from a pawn shop in the state of Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, of course, being one of the highest states that we have as far as just pure harvest numbers coming out of that state. There's a lot of deer in Pennsylvania. And the deer was huge deer. And I think he's a 6x7, if I remember it. We replicated him. And it got scored, and it netted 202 and some change. It's a new state record for Pennsylvania. And again, Jay Fish owns this head, and they've done some, historical research and tracked it back to, I think, somewhere in the 1940s. It's real yellow colored. It's got the patina of age with it. It's a beautiful, beautiful head. And it, I'm not going to divulge what it's sold for, but it's sold for a very low price. And it came from a pawn shop of all places. And they're out there. There's still a lot of heads out there that haven't been recognized, or people, they're floating around who knows where. Could be somebody shot it and threw it up in the attic, and somebody's going to remodel the house or tear it down, and somebody goes up there and says, "Look what I found up here," and it becomes a new record or whatever. That is not as uncommon as you might think, because for some people, deer antlers don't mean much, and for some people, they could look at a deer antler and not know that it's truly as big as it is. They might say, "Oh, it's a big one," but most of the times, when somebody is an eyewitness to a deer antler, whether they see it on the hoof or they see it hanging on a wall, they're usually embellishing it, and that's what we normally expect. Is it's not as big as they thought, but it goes the other way sometimes.
That's a good point, because when do you think? And my family had a deer head like that. I never really deer hunted much growing up. I was more into waterfowl and birds, but we had this rack that was passed down, this 10-point rack from generation to generation. Of course, the stories all varied, well, I did, all that kind of stuff, but it had that patina you were talking about. But when do you think, because back in the day, did they even talk score numbers? When do you think that actually started?
Well, years ago, big deer were discussed in the terms of body weight. And that was, if somebody said I shot a big deer, it meant I shot a big bodied deer, that you'd scale out at a feed mill or something and find out how big, or a butcher shop, figure out how big the deer really was. The Boone and Crockett scoring system, as I've said, it didn't, I think, gain national recognition until the deer classics, what we call deer classics, or the deer shows, began in the 70s and 80s and started popping up all over the nation. And that milked out of the woodwork a lot of these big deer that were brought in to be scored. They existed, but nobody ever knew, for the most part, how big they really were. And then there was a real movement that these deer came out. In fact, a funny story I always tell is when I was doing some of my first shows, I'd have the signage up underneath the deer indicating the score of the deer. And a lady came to me and says, "What does that mean? 245 and 2/8 B and C." And I said, "Well, that deer was shot 245 years before Christ." And she goes, "Oh," good joke. And of course, I told her the truth. But that was a naivete out there at the time. People were just learning about deer antlers, and that, there was a way to assign them a position of ranking amongst each other by scoring them. And so I don't know my history well enough on Boone and Crockett, but I think they were around and started somewhere in the 50s is when that organization was put together, along with Pope and Young. They're not the same, but they both emerged around the same time frame. So that's where it all kind of began, I think, and went from there.
The score conversation's interesting. It's become such a stigma in our industry, a 150-inch buck or a 140-inch buck, and that's a trophy, and there's so much focus on score these days. You have the opportunity to have seen so many big bucks and have put your hands on them. What's your feeling on the way our industry, hunting wise, is kind of aligned right now on the focus on score and what is a trophy and what isn't a trophy?
Oh, I've had a lot of personal issues, feelings, I should say, not issues, but feelings on that. I think it's a shame that our society has fallen prey to the idea that, if a deer doesn't score a certain size, that, we're disappointed as a hunter with what we harvested. The truth of it is a lot of deer that I've handled just don't exist in most woods. They don't exist there. You can go and get all pumped up reading and watching video and so forth on these big bucks, and then go out in your woods and want to harvest something like that. It just simply doesn't exist. And for me to say to you, this is how you should feel about your deer, I mean, we could take that across the board on anything that we have as far as ownership and say, your home or this or that or anything, or your income, should be this and this for you to feel good about yourself. And I think it's swinging now finally to a point where the video is no longer, it used to be a guy harvested deer and boom, up on the screen would be a score, because everybody's like, what's that score? What's that score? And it's just getting down now where I think people are saying, this is a nice deer. For this area, what this area produces, a 120 is a nice deer for this area. If you're hunting in an area that's managed intensely for big bucks and they exist and there's trail cam pictures of them, then waiting for something bigger is a good call too. But I think we need to reevaluate why we hunt and just, get back to the grassroots of the whole thing. If I'm hunting and I'm out there for the enjoyment of the experience and this deer that comes in is going to make me happy and I want to harvest them, then I'd say go ahead and harvest the deer and go home happy. And don't let the scoring system be your barometer of what you accomplished or didn't. I've got a lot of deer I've harvested in my early career of hunting that, are what we would typically call the basket rack bucks. And I can tell you the old ticker was going 100 miles an hour and I was excited as could be, because in those days, bow hunting was so new and people laughed at you, you're actually going to go out with a bow and try to kill a deer? Yeah, I'm going to do that, and took up that challenge. But, there were no trophies in my early career. They're just averaged, year and a half old, 2.5-year-old bucks.
But they're trophies to you.
They have a story. I mean, I remember first one I shot, he jumped off of a rock embankment and ended up in a tree.
Yeah.
I had retrieved the deer out of a tree. His back end was stuck in the crotch of a tree and his head wasn't even touching the ground. So, you don't forget things like that. And he just was a little forky, and I rattled him in. I had read a book, and this was before all the magazines were even talking about that. I was calling in deer with my voice before anybody had ever made a grunt call, because I heard a deer do that. And I thought, well, that must mean something. So I started doing it and I started getting responses. And, my brother-in-law said they don't rattle up in the North. And I says, why not? He says, it only works in Texas. And I says, why does it only work in Texas? Are those deer talking to the ones up here? So, I mean, I was so naive and so stupid, but my innocence kept me going with trying it. And it took me 2 or 3 years of going out with a set of horns and rattling before I got a response. And a deer walked in and I shot him with my bow. And then, of course, I told everybody. And then, hey, I'm going to get a set of horns, and it catches on. But, I just thought it's got to work. If it works there, it's got to work here.
I got a couple comments on that too, as far as the, the scoring and all that. And I remember that because when I was into waterfowl, but I remember when we started to kind of pay attention to deer hunting and stuff through the company Illusion. And of course, I was doing exactly what you just described, figuring out how the animal communicates and this and that. And so when I morphed into deer, those exact same things that you talked about is exactly what built this company.
Yes.
And so I get that. And that was around the time, the era of the VHS videos, when Miles Keller and, not so much Lee and Tiffany. It was more with their friends. I'm trying to think of their name down in Iowa. Kiskies, exactly. So that was the era that I kind of came into the market, and it was numbers. That number would flash up, this, and that. And so as my experiences as a waterfowler and a turkey hunter and things like that morphed into the deer hunting, my take on it and my fulfillment came from the experience of the deer, exactly like what you were talking about. And when I brought my boys into the company, you can see how JJ, that same thing was instilled into him. And so if you look at the content of the Deer Society and what we're trying to do is we're getting past that number. Now, there's a little bit of guilt there because you get those big 200 plus inch deer. It's great marketing material for a product, but we're noticing more that the stories and the names that we're giving these deer are as big as anything, because we go to these consumer shows and they're like, oh, that's Mr. Maybe. They knew that exact deer. Right. They didn't know the score of the deer. They didn't know if it was a record or anything like that. In fact, some people ask where it was shot. But it was the story behind that deer and that experience. Yeah. And that's exactly, that's what fulfills us, not only as, hunters, but I think the market's craving it, because just look at our video views. People want that experience. They don't want, oh, look at what I got, and that kind of a thing. It's not about the hunter. It's about the deer and the experience. So that's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that. I think that's where we, our culture turns constantly different corners of what we think is important, or, how we should view something. And I think we have turned the corner to where people are starting to recognize, getting back to the root cause of why we hunt in the first place. And, harvesting an animal obviously is the end goal, but the hundreds of hours of preparation, putting tree stands up, managing your land and all that goes into it. Trail camera work. I get so excited about trail camera, when I pull my cards, it's like I'm, I can't wait to get back and see what's on the camera. And that has become as enjoyable for me as hunting in itself has.
And watching that deer evolve from year to year, you're like, where did that one come from? And all of a sudden you start looking back and the picture's like, oh my God, remember that one 2 years ago there he is. That's him. Look what he's done.
Yeah. Or they disappear for, half a season and you think somebody harvested him and all of a sudden, boom, he's right back. And it's like he made it, and so there's a lot of things there that are fun about them. And I think we're moving that direction again. To where we're getting back to what I think it's really all about. And everybody has the dream of harvesting a giant buck. If you're a hunter, it's always, that's what fuels you to go out and say, maybe today's the day, Yeah. Maybe I'm going to stumble into that big deer, or he's, I've been seeing him in this area and maybe he's going to make a showing and I'll get a chance to harvest him. But it's hard. It's a big challenge to do that.
Do you remember those days back? And, starting out deer hunting, I was a gun hunter, obviously. And I remember the season was coming up, and then, this next weekend it starts, and next thing you know, you're buying the Outdoor Life one and you're reading the story of grandpa and the grandson's buck, and you can't even sleep the night before. No kidding. You may get 2 hours of sleep. And if you are sleeping, it's like this REM thing with all these, visions of deer and everything going through your head, and then you get out there and then all of a sudden you're sitting there and the cold reality sets in, it's like, okay, I'm out here, it's getting cold. And, but then that buck shows up and then that adrenaline picks up. But, that's just, it's really what, it's that experience, and it's just really, really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've launched it here at the Deer Society, the Whitetails from Scratch series, and Whitetails from Scratch. What we're doing is we're taking a farm that Mike and the boys bought, and we're taking it from the ground level and trying to create it into the best whitetail farm, but the best really property that we can to grow these whitetails. And we're doing it with Andy Orr and AWS. And what's interesting, I was just having a conversation with Andy the other day, and he said, the goal is to create the best property and to hold 6, 7, 8-year-old deer. He said, a lot of the clients that I've worked with, he said, it's super interesting. He said, because they'll get a farm and 5 years down the road, they'll have it to finally the point where they can hold multiple 6, 7-year-old deer. And you'd think, wow, it's perfect. This is exactly what I wanted. He said, you know what that guy will do? He said, he'll go and sell it. He said, and go and start doing it for a new farm. He said, it's counterintuitive, because as hunters, that sounds great. I want that too, to just have a farm that holds 6 and 7, 8-year-old deer and hunt it. He said, but it's not really about that. He said, it's about the whole process, and that's what we're going through in this series. But it's about, putting in new food plots, building your ground, checking trail cameras, watching these deer grow. It's not about just killing the biggest deer or we as hunters want to experience that all year round. That's a challenge for us.
Yeah.
And that's what's really cool about it. I will say one other thing too. You said something to me years ago, Klaus, and you said, when I work on these deer or get to experience this, what I want to tell people, what I want to show people, it's not about the hunter. It's about the deer. It's about this animal that walked for so long and the experiences that deer had. That's the stories. That's what I want to bring to life with these antlers, and that's the stories that I want to tell people.
Yeah, when I've had the privilege of handling, many of these big historic bucks, some come to me without a story, some come to me with a lot of history. And, to sit there and think I'm actually holding this antler and working on it, and, all the years that this deer survived, hunting, predation, if it was a hard winter in that area, made it through. And, here it is in my shop, and I'm actually getting a chance to work on it. And I've always felt that what I do, it's been an ends to a means to an end, I should say, for a financial reason, but it also has been, as I viewed it, a preservation of these big bucks. Most of what Bass Pro and Cabela's has, we've molded that. Not all of it, but most of it. And should a disaster ever happen where, a fire, and I'm sure most of these buildings are sprinklered and most likely these things would survive. But if something did happen, just a comforting thought to know that this 100-some years of hunting history is not lost, because these are the biggest and the best, and they come from all over the United States and Canada and even Mexico, and so you have this big collection of hunting history preserved. With we have a cement, we call it the bunker, cement ceiling, cement floor, and cement walls with a sprinkler system locked. That's where all our master copies are, to all the deer that we've done. So they're protected, and I view that as a very important thing, that, should anything ever happen, they're there. But I feel very strongly that the deer is the hero of the story. Us as hunters know that despite all our efforts and all our planning and strategizing, there's an element of luck that goes into this. I've had it where I'm just pulling my bow up, and here walks in a big buck. I haven't got my bow off the ground, and I'm thinking he's going to see my bow go up the tree, but I got to pull that bow up as fast as I can and get an arrow on it. And I've had that happen, and I shoot him. I'm not in the tree a minute, But then I've been in that tree all year, and I don't shoot nothing. Yep. So you have the extreme opposites, the bookends of success and failure, and it is a very passionate pursuit to hunt these deer, but things have to go right. That deer has to be, he exists, he could be very close to you, but he has to be active. He has to be on his feet and moving around in the huntable hours that you have to pursue him. And I always think that Lady Luck has to play a role in that, where you just go, it was meant to be today. I've seen, we've had examples where you shoot at a deer and you miss him, and he just stands down there looking dumber in a box of rocks, and you go, I got another chance, and you knock an arrow and you shoot. Now, that doesn't happen all the time. Most of the times he's blown by just you making a wrong move or something. It's like, why this day was he so tolerant of my failures, and the next day the deer, explodes at the slightest mistake, and I've always thought there's got to be something, to this luck aspect or whatever, that it all comes together. And then the deer is the hero. He's the focus. And again, in our culture, too many times the person that harvests them becomes the focus. And I've, not that that's wrong to honor his accomplishment, but the deer to me is the real hero. It's the real story. This deer.
So the deer that, all these great deer, these record deer that, you're talking about that you've had your hands on and have been able to work with, I would imagine that exact description that you just said goes true for all of those deer. It could be, someone who's a beginner. It could be someone who got lucky. It could be someone who's been an expert, someone who pursued this deer for 6 years that, all that stuff. And if you just kind of, like you say, you backpedal that, it really is about the deer though, even though the different experiences are going to be different. And like I say, about the time when I was growing up and starting deer hunting, and you dream of these big deer, it can still happen. Mm-hmm. That can still happen.
Absolutely.
So as far as and I don't mean to take on the questioning here, but as far as the trends that you're seeing, and what do you think the trend is for the future?
Well, I think things, I'm kind of a analytical person. I look at a lot of different things that way, and I see things come full circle. Take wildlife art. I mean, it got saturated many years ago and it imploded upon itself, and now we see it coming back. And everything just reciprocates, and I think deer hunting is the same thing. We've gone through the craze of, the ego-driven aspect of hunting, and I think we're returning, slowly, but I think we're returning back to our grassroots, where people are starting to ask the question of themselves, why do I hunt? Why do I go out and pursue this deer? It's nice to have camaraderie and have your friends, congratulate you, because they know, as persons that do the same thing, the effort that goes into it and how hard it is to accomplish harvesting a big deer. But I think it's where the hunters themselves are starting to ask themselves the question, why do I do this? Is it for that? Is it for the praise of other people? Or do I go out and hunt because I have a passion and a desire to be in the woods and enjoy the totality of what's happening? I mean, the sunrises you get to see. I remember one specific morning I went out, and it was at that point in October where all the maple leaves, I was in a maple forest, had turned, starting to turn yellow, but had some green on them, and it had been a very heavy frost. And as the sun rose and hit those leaves, it started to melt, and the whole woods became surreal, with a glow and a glisten that you would see only in a Redland painting, but I just sat there and it was like, I will never see this again as long as I live, what's happening right now. I remember it to this very day, that experience. There was no deer involved that day with what I was doing, but the experience of being in the tree in the silence of the woods and hearing like rain, all that frost just dripping on those leaves, and experiencing this thing that only lasted probably a total of 5-10 minutes. Unbelievable experience. And hadn't I been there, I would have missed it, sleeping in bed, but I was there because I was hunting, but it had nothing to do with the deer. Yep. And I think every one of us have memories like that we can reflect upon. And I think in the end, those are the memories that, combined with the harvest, is why we're there. But they play a bigger role, I think, in why we go and why we do what we do. And I think we're awakening to that again, the root cause of why we do this. And I see that being brought forth in videos, and a company like yours that's taking and turning the corner on that, where it's just not all about pursuit of the trophy, but the experience of that pursuit.
It's funny you bring that up, because as you're saying this, with the way I think, I'm all of a sudden re-experiencing those same things, oh, I remember that day. Yeah. But as I started to kind of reminisce when you were telling your story, all of a sudden I just felt a warmness in my heart. And I thought about the experience that I had with my son,
yes,
JJ, in a couple of situations. And Chris, when he was first learning to bow hunt, and when he came back he was a combat Marine and came back from Iraq, and we took him out, and JJ got him his first deer. I mean, it's so, that's it. That's the whole thing. And right. That's really what built this company. And that's what we want to share. That's what we want to, if there's a way we can change the trends to come back to that, that's everything that we're going to do. And I'm noticing it on social media. Mm-hmm. It used to be where you were getting a lot of that when social media was kind of new and everybody's, wants to be the, TV star, whatever it was. And that's kind of the way they would communicate on their pages. And then there would be a lot of back and forth and people ripping on each other. It got really ugly for a while.
Yes.
That's starting to kind of taper off now.
Yeah.
And so when you see someone either belittle somebody or say something that's a little derogatory toward, a story or a picture, you'll see other people, like on our forum especially, we don't even really have to manage it. They'll come in and say, hey, and they just shut that person down and they just disappear.
Yeah.
And that's that trend you're talking about. And that's a great thing, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of, you look at how the industry is and sponsors and advertisers and things like that too. And we've gone through this transition of hard sell, soft sell, shove things down your throat. I take Sitka as an example. If you go onto social media and you look at Sitka's page, now, sure, there's big animals on there. But if you look at their Instagram, so much of it is beauty and landscape and about the experience, that their company, I feel, is built, and they've done a really good job, and they're just an example. There's others that do it, but you go on there and you get a feeling of excitement and that warm feeling and that experience. It's not about, oh, here's a great big deer. Now, they have great big deer, and there's obviously something to be said about that, but it's about the experience. It's giving you that warm feeling in your heart, like you both talked about. Yeah. So, it's interesting how we are coming full circle and getting back to the roots of really why we do it, right?
And the same thing is happening in the trophy, the interpretation of trophies. The deer above me is a good example, that you could take almost most of the other 200-inch net typicals that exist and fit them inside there. The wow factor that I talk about with many of my, comrades in the deer collecting world is, it's just a big deer when it looks big. You don't need to have somebody put a tape measure on it or, assign numbers to it. It's a big deer. It's a really, really big deer, regardless of what it scores. And we're seeing that trend also. I know probably more avid hunters, pursuers of trophy whitetails that will not have them entered. It used to be a little bit because of protection of, where I hunt, and if people know I'm harvesting deer like this from this property that I lease, they're protecting their lease interests and so forth. But it's gone to the point where people don't need to have the bragging rights anymore to have a certificate or a trophy or something or some kind of medallion underneath their deer to say, it's a big deer. They're hunting for themselves. They're hunting for the pure pleasure of what they do. And they're satisfied in saying, I don't know, I never had them scored, or I did, but it's not important to me. And they don't enter them into the record books anymore. And there's getting to be a big trend and movement that way where people aren't doing that. And I'm not saying that's a positive or negative thing, but it's just showing this shift in the way we think about the trophies that we, harvest. And it's not that important anymore to have somebody say, oh, wow, I got another Pope and Young buck and, 146 and 7/8, It's just not there.
Right.
Yeah, a good example of that is I'll refer back to JJ. He's just been hot, when it comes to taking deer. But what was it, 2-3 years ago? He shot 2 deer. And the talking point on those 2 deer were not so much the score, it was the age. They were both, he shot 2 6.5-year-old deer. Now, you look at the score of those deer, completely different.
Yes.
Completely different.
Yes.
The one deer, was, I would say, was a show off. He was the bigger scoring deer. We had years and years of footage and history with that deer. The other deer was like a swamp buck, just a beastly old animal. Didn't score that great. But man, was he a beast. He was one of the toughest deer to hunt. We hardly got any footage, if any footage of all with that deer. But the fact that he refers to it, or a lot of people refer to it as 2 6.5-year-old deer, that was his achievement that he takes the pride in, not so much the numbers.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, when you look at all the trophies put together, if you were to do an analysis of them, the far majority, I would say probably 99% of them were shot by unassuming hunters. I mean, people that just went out and, a lot of them were, I didn't even know the deer existed. He's just a, gun hunter, shotgun guy. Deer season comes along, he goes out and he decides to go to his favorite old place. Never did any scouting, never did any trail camera work, never any preparation. Oh, there's my pop can from last year when I was here, and sits down and pops the new state record. That is the more common story than the one where this guy has put all this time and effort and pursuit and worked hard to kill a deer. It happens, but there again, that element of just being in the right place at the right time is so, big in this whole thing, this whole trophy thing. Most of those are killed by people that had no idea or very little idea that a deer like that ever existed, and they just happened to stumble into it. Some of them in the craziest. I could tell stories for hours on just how crazy some of these things are, And the Mitch Vakach from Minnesota, he's 14 years old, got cold. I'm walking back to the truck. So, that's the fastest way across that CRP field. Well, he stumbles upon that big giant buck that becomes a new state record. He pops it on his way back because he's cold. He's going to his vehicle. That kind of story, more common than you think.
Yeah, talk about right place at the right time.
Yeah, but but does that mean that just because it happened that way, that's not any less of a story or experience of a guy who, pursued a deer for years and years? And it's the same. It's like that grandpa story I told you about, where you're dreaming all night, you go out there, and all of a sudden that thing, you stumble on it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a great story too. That's the experience, whether it was by chance, by accident, whatever. That's hunting, and that's why we do it.
Yeah, that dream of the big one. There is no question amongst everybody. I think we have that commonality. The dream, the hope that it could happen, is what fuels us to get out. And I think anybody who's really honest, is going to say, that dream of hearing that crackling brush and looking over your shoulder and saying, "Oh my goodness, look at that." That's what I've waited for all my life, and now to put it together where you follow through with a good shot and harvest the animal. But it's and I'm 60. I've hunted for 40 years of my life, and I've yet to have that. I've only sighted once or twice a buck that I would even consider might make Boone and Crockett, but I've never had any opportunity, looking at me or saying, "Oh wow, there it is." That one I've waited for all these years, It's hard.
And I've never had that feeling either. I've talked to a lot of guys who obviously have, but it's interesting. I would say that even if you have that experience and you make the perfect shot and they get that deer, it doesn't go away. No. It can't, that experience just keeps growing and growing, and that urge and that passion and that obsession, it never stops. And that's why we keep doing what we do.
Yeah.
What do you have a favorite deer?
Oh man. That's the question. I just had this discussion with a collector on the way to this podcast today. And the way I answer that, I do. I have the James Jordan buck, not because it comes from the state of Wisconsin where I'm from, but the color of the antlers, the deep veining, there's no other antler that looks like that I've ever worked on. And the history of that deer, getting, brought it to the taxidermist who disappeared, and then the controversy, was it a Minnesota deer, was it a Wisconsin deer? And after all those years, his relative bought it for $3 at a rummage sale. Oh. And he's a cousin or whatever of James Jordan, and said, "Look at this deer I just bought." And he goes, that's my deer, from all those years ago. And this is before trophies, this is before all of that began. It's 1914 when that deer was harvested. So it's such an incredible story, a drama an unfolding drama of events that, finally bring that deer to the place of being the world record typical. And it remains probably still to this day my favorite deer for all those different reasons, but it's not the biggest looking one by any means. If you put it up here, it would be dwarfed by this buck here. So it just has all those elements that I think make it what it is,
Yeah. Let's talk about a deer that was located right here in Minnesota, the Minnesota Monarch, which has become a pretty famous deer. One of the biggest ones ever. Tell us a little bit about, you've obviously had the opportunity to handle the Minnesota Monarch lots and replicate it lots. Mm-hmm. Just tell us a little bit of the story behind that deer for people who might not know.
Well, it's an interesting story. It comes from Ely, Minnesota, actually not far outside the city limits on what would be the eastern side of the city as you drive through it. Our fish company is located there, so I've gotten some exposure to the area where that deer was and where Tom Walton had lived there. I don't know if he lives on that residence anymore or not, but back in the years, he was feeding deer when it was still legal to do so in the state of Minnesota. And these deer would come and yard in his, yard up in the winter in his locality there. And this deer was one that visited his feeding station quite frequently. And he lost his antlers there. It is a very well-known deer. Jeff LeBaron was the first person to uncover it. This is back again in those years, way before, the pen raised thing had started. Deer like that couldn't be raised in enclosures at all. There weren't many enclosures, if any, around when the deer was discovered. So, it was a definite 100% wild deer, no question of it. And it is to the date. I mean, we set it up with a spread that we thought was accurate, and it got scored, and it still is the biggest non-typical of all deer. Like this one behind me has a 5-pointer, 5x5. It's the biggest deer ever scored in any classification, any way you want to do it. Found, harvested, pickup, bow kill, whatever. It's the biggest deer, antler score. And it, the one side itself scores 180, the left side, the big left side.
I'd love to shoot a 180-inch deer with both sides.
One side, one side scoring that, and it was back in the day when Jeff LeBaron was a writer and kind of stumbled upon that deer, and it came out of the woodwork, and Jeff called me on that, and he said, "What should we call this deer?" And I said, "Well, why don't you just call it Minnesota Monarch?" And that's how it got its name. So I will take credit for that.
I did not know that the original name Minnesota Monarch came from you.
A lot of history has happened in our place, and we've talked about that when Chuck Arnold purchased the Jordan Breen, or not Chuck Arnold, but Larry Huffman had purchased from Chuck Arnold the Jordan Breen, the Kohler, and the Fleming sheds. Well, that transaction took place in my kitchen when I lived in Ellsworth, and we picked up Chuck from the airport back in the day when you could fly and you could take a box and put it into the storage of the aircraft. Now they've got all these regulations, but he came with 4 big boxes, and those antlers were in there, and I saw Larry Huffman write the big check for those 4 antlers, and Larry was really choked up when he did that.
Wow.
Because he had Larry, for those that knew him, Larry was one of those collectors that had a real passion, but it wasn't so much for himself as it was for the deer. And he always had a feeling that deer needed to be in the state of Wisconsin, and it needed to be out in public for people to see it. And he spent quite a bit of money to achieve that. And it was neat to be there and witness that taking place, because a lot of times collectors, the whole hunting world gets accused of it's all ego, it's all about money, and I beg to differ. I've seen some pretty neat things where there's more than just money behind that, and that was an incident where you know, like I said, it happened there, and I saw Larry write that check, and it was like he felt mission accomplished. The deer's back home where it belongs. You know?
That's a great
Yeah.
story.
And it was, I mean, it was locked in Chuck had in his home, he had built for lack of better terms, a walk-in vault, you know, that he also felt it was very important to protect them. They weren't just hanging on a wall in the house. He had a vault like you'd have at a bank. You walk in there and it was all protected and everything so that those antlers would never get lost in a fire or anything. And that's the level he took it to. And then Larry purchased them and they ended up back here. And then Larry started doing shows with what was, you know, that got added to by him purchasing the Legendary Collection. And then he named the whole collection the Legendary Collection. And that's how that evolved. But those 4 deer became part of that. And then for the first time, people got to see those deer, you know. So pretty cool.
So this is for my own personal understanding. I remember going to consumer shows and seeing the Legendary Collection, all at these consumer shows. And who owns that, or how are you tied to that, or how does that? What is that all about?
The whole Legendary Whitetails collection started out with Dick Idle.
Yeah,
Dick Idle was the first one, you know, and Dick Idle and Chuck Arnold, Fred Goodwin. There's a couple other names out there. They escape me right now, but they were the true pioneers of collecting. They were collecting before antlers were worth anything. So these heads got purchased. I'm not going to divulge some of those numbers, but they got purchased for very modest prices to what they were sold for later on. But they collected because they just liked them. And nobody else was competing, and they just collected antlers. And then all of a sudden, it grew into a phenomenon, and you know, big dollars were being spent by people, and it turned into something totally different. But Dick had purchased many antlers, you know, earlier in his career, and formed a traveling show called Legendary Whitetails, and then that was sold to John Morgan and Tom Brown, who also then in turn went and toured for many years to the different shows and so forth with it. And then Larry got in cahoots, I should say, with the Carter brothers, who were going to do the museum in Wisconsin, and started funding that objective. He was kind of the money man, and they were buying antlers and everything. And then that went south. And then from there, he bought Chuck's heads, the 4 I mentioned, and he bought all those heads that he had with the Carter boys, and that became his property then. And then the Legendary Collection became available for sale. He purchased, you know, several other individual heads, and then the whole composite of collecting became Legendary Whitetails. And then when Larry passed, they had already sold all that off to Bass Pro Shops, and Legendary Whitetails now is an apparel gift company, you know.
The branded,
yeah, selling hunting related, you know, clothing and things like that.
So a lot of these deer that, you know, the Legendary Collection, like you mentioned, Mike, that you see at a consumer show, or, you know, there's obviously big deer when you walk into Bass Pro Shops and Cabela's and Field and Stream. Are most of those deer, when people look at them, replicas?
No, what you know, Bass Pro has now opened up their whitetail museum at Springfield, Missouri, their headquarters, and they've retrieved a lot of the originals from the stores that they had, but there's still a fair amount of those out there, and we were making copies for them to put in the store to, you know, to retrieve the original and bring it back to the home office to put in their museum that they put up there. I'm not sure what all is in there. I want to go there pretty soon. In fact, I'm planning a trip here in the next couple months to go there.
Awesome. Good deal. So let's talk about the reproduction thing here again. What are some of the benefits? You obviously talked about, you know, if something were to ever happen, preserving that history. You know, what are some of the other benefits of guys replicating their deer? Why would somebody come to you and say, I want to replicate this deer?
Well, there's several reasons. One is to have it in multiple locations. If you have a business like yours, you may want to have it in your office because you spend a lot of time there. and you'd like to look at your deer head, during your work hours. The biggest reason that we promote it for is protection of the trophy. I just got a call from, now I can't remember his name, gentleman that we had done a giant buck for here in the state of Wisconsin just last week. And he says, my house burned down.
Oh,
He said, I lost everything. He said, I had to run in and get my wife out because she was incapacitated or knocked out already from the fumes, and he got her out and saved her, and lost everything and his deer head. Well, thank goodness we molded it, because, that process is already going on now to replace that.
Sure.
So, it's not obviously a house fire or a disaster that totals out your belongings is not a common occurrence, but for the money spent to mold an average head is, say between $1,500 and $2,000. For that money spent, that gives you great comfort in knowing that should anything ever happen to this deer, I have a backup plan in where I can replace it, and all the insurance in the world.
I was just going to say that about the insurance.
If I said to you, I'll give you $10,000, because you lost your deer head and you get your $10,000, I can tell you right now, being a hunter myself, that's not going to satisfy the loss. You can't say, oh man, well, I'm $10,000, I'm okay, I'm fine. I got my $10,000. You're gonna say, I'll never shoot another deer as long as I live like that one, and it's true.
And you'll never see that deer again.
And you'll never see that deer again. So it is for people that are looking for a very, what I would say, inexpensive way of protecting that investment of time that you've done. I mean, it's a lifetime in most instances that you've spent pursuing this sport, and now finally harvested something that you really feel is important to you. It's the cheapest insurance you can buy. We even tell people, just mold it and put the mold away. We mold things with rubbers now that have a long library life. You can take them out 25 years from now and they'll cast as well as the day they were made. So we build them with those types of materials. So it's a great reason to do it. And more people are for that reason. Yeah.
I can imagine. It's so interesting that going back to the process, and you're doing a lot more things now. You don't just do whitetails. I mean, you mentioned you're doing the world record moose right now. So lots of things, and also now landscaping and these different features in big showrooms and things like that. One that stands out is the tree that you did in Ely. Tell me about that tree a little bit, because it's so interesting. Watching this process unfold, the whole molding process. Tell me a little bit about that tree.
Well, we had secured a contract to do the playroom in the Ely Bear Center, the North American Bear Center in Ely, Minnesota, and it called for a white pine. And so we had already located a white pine and cut it down. They're protected, actually. You can't just go out and cut down a white pine in Minnesota. In that area, there's protections against that. So we had located one, and then one of my workers came to me and said, my buddy's got a giant white pine out in his cabin by the lake, and he's going to take it down because it got struck by lightning, and he's going to build a new house. He doesn't want it to blow over and go into his new home. So a lot of snow on the ground still. I says, well, how big is it? And he says, really, really big. So I said, well, let's take a run down and take a look at it. It was only 20 minutes from our studio. So we ran out and looked at it, and it had gotten struck by lightning, so it created this big fissure crack, real gnarly looking feature right down the middle of the tree, all the way to the ground. And I go, but I got to get that. That's neat. So we purchased the tree from the landowner, and then he had already hired a guy to come out and professionally cut it, because it was 80 to 100 feet tall. It was a big giant, must have been well over 100 years old. And we felled the tree onto the lake. We were in the spring already, so I had contacted some guys to get out there and skid the tree off the lake, and I was worried about the ice being thick enough. I think we still had about 12 to 18 inches of ice, but in another week or two there would have been none. So we were kind of in a hard way to get that tree out of there. And we filmed all that. So we got that out of there and brought it to the studio. And then, of course, those logs were unbelievably heavy. So we had big chain hoists attached to the building and the ceiling joists, and lifted that log up and moved it around in there and, molded the whole thing. It was a big project for us. We've never molded anything that big, but the mold was very, very good. And now we can use it for future projects. We can apply that many different ways. We put it around a support column. We can put it, freestanding like we did in the Bear Center. And we cast so many of the trees, limbs, so we can edit the tree any which way we want. We can add limbs to it. We can, make the tree look totally different. Every time we do it, it'll be custom looking. So it's a lot of work, but a lot of hours. It's one of those business moves you make where you don't want to know.
So you're casting the needles on the tree?
No, we just cast all the branches in the trunk.
Branches, okay.
And then we buy synthetic branches, that have a false or a fake needle. They're very realistic looking when they get done, and then you graft all that together and put it together, and it comes out looking like the real deal.
Do you know how much that the final reproduction of the tree weighed?
The reproduction. Well, you heard it crash. Ryan was there when we were filming it, and one of our links to the chain that held the chain hoist up, for whatever reason, it was rated right, well within what that tree would have weighed, but somehow it failed and snapped or bent, and then the tree let loose. I would guess, it was basically made out of foam with a resin shell on it, but I would guess, 400 pounds maybe, be my guess of what the reproduction weighed. The original, I have no idea. It's thousands.
Heavy.
Oh, it was, still alive when we cut it, so it was wet. We just recently, a friend of mine that was in a hard way, he burns wood, and I said, you want some wood? And he says, yeah. So he came, and we just a few weeks ago hoisted that out of the studio.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had big hoist with cables, and he had a big flatbed that tipped down, and we got it up on there, and he went home and cut it up for firewood. So it's gone.
Wow. That white pine, that's got a little bit of a curly bark, don't it?
Yeah, it's a pretty rough bark. Yeah. So we had a lot of where the skid steer forks hit it to lift it up and get it out of there. It had damaged the bark, and so we had to replace portions of the bark and repair all that. And we still have we harvested about 45 feet of the tree. So we still have the upper 30 foot. Well, it's 15. The first section is about 15 feet. So we have what's left to still cast, but we've put that on hold waiting for an order or something that was somebody that had a big mezzanine or something, a big, say an airport or something wanted a tree like that. Then we would go ahead and cast the rest of it, because it's a huge investment. The rubber alone on that we used, oh goodness sakes, I did the math on it. I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of $13,000 or $14,000 just for the cost of the rubber.
Wow.
Not to mention all the hours to put it on, but it was a lot of rubber that it took to make that mold,
Hollywood hasn't called you to put one in a
No,
set
I'm
yet,
waiting. I'm waiting for that call. Yeah. There's not too many guys around that have that.
Like the old
tree like that.
The Bonanza sets. Remember how they used to have
Yeah.
those set up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That could be your next thing is
Oh,
building
yeah.
outdoor sets in Hollywood.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean we haven't gone there yet. We haven't gotten any calls from them. yet. So
Not yet.
be nice. It'd be nice. Yeah. No, it's amazing. I mean, where when I first started out in this industry, we were stealing from various other industries to do what we did. I mean, our rubber came from General Electric. That was a wire insulator. That's what it was used for. It wasn't designed to cast, artifacts and so forth. And there was nothing on the market. No companies existed. And that was, that became a growing thing. Now you have, goodness sakes, there's a pile of companies out there. with offering materials to make things. And so it was a challenge in the first years when I did this. You could call somebody and say, I'm making antlers and I'm having this problem. And they'd look at you like, I don't know what to tell you. We don't have any remedies for that. They would break easy. They'd yellow. There was all sorts of problems with them because we didn't have what we have today. So
Interesting. Wow. One last thing I'd like to cover here before we run out of time. You've experienced and dealt with a lot of guys who have shot, obviously, some of the biggest deer in the world. We've heard stories from Dan Kaufman, who for a long time had the number 2 deer in the world. And he's going to be on a podcast here in a couple of weeks. But from your experience, what is that experience like, when you talk to these guys and they shoot a really big deer? There's all these ideas out there that Bass Pro offered them $100,000 and
yeah. What's it worth?
yeah.
What's that like?
Well, I'll tell you, every deer season opens up and first thing you hear, somebody just shot a world record. And I remember the Bob Decker buck from Minnesota. It was it came to be known as the Field and Stream buck. And it was a world record.
Minnesota or Wisconsin?
No, it was, I'm sorry. It was Wisconsin. It was down in Buffalo County.
Yep.
Down where Shane is at. Yeah, and that was the new world record, and it got dubbed the Field and Stream buck because the trail cam photos came out and people were scoring the deer, on the hoof, and there's some non-typical points that were a problem for the deer. But the rumor mill is huge, and you get all these stories of the next new world record, and this guy shot this and this guy shot that. And the Bass Pro thing is another one that we've heard. Bass Pro offered him $1 million for that rack, and I know Johnny, those numbers have never been paid for anything. I know a lot of what those numbers are, and they peak at 100,000. I've never heard of a deer selling for much more than that. And the numbers that are thrown out there that he got, or it's somebody, if you shoot a new world record, you'll be a millionaire.
Yeah.
No, not going to happen. Milo did pretty well with his deer because he got some people to help him market it properly. And I'm not saying that a new world record couldn't make you some good money with merchandising and shows and things like that, but everything is changing. The demographics on the deer shows are dying. I was just at I went to Reno, and I went to the SCI show in Texas, and I can tell you those attendance numbers are way down. And I was there. We never saw anything. When we were in Reno, we never saw it get busy. When vendor after vendor after vendor said, we didn't sell a thing. We didn't sell one hunt. We didn't sell one fishing trip. We didn't sell anything,
Why do you think that is?
I just think there's a shift again. Our whole commerce of how we do commerce is changing with the advent of technology. And a lot of things are being sold on Amazon. The brick and mortar stores are all in trouble. We see giants that are struggling. That you look at them and say that they're never going to struggle. Well, and they are, because they can't. People don't do that anymore. They don't shop like that. And I think everything is changing that way. Sad story is, for the big box stores like Bass Pro, I've had so many people tell me personally that they go there, they go into the store, they try on the clothing, they find what they need, they take their phone, they take a picture. Bass Pro made the sale, but they're not going to get the money because they're going to go home and order it on Amazon. So they're well aware of that, but it's an unfortunate reality of what's going on. And I think the deer shows and all these sporting shows and everything, they've been around for so many years. When monitors were first out, and a guy would have a monitor at a show for perhaps showing a deer being harvested on film, there was a crowd around there like a rock star was going to come out, it was just packed with people watching that monitor. Guy's got to shoot that deer on a monitor, and it was a big thing. Now people walk by and you can have them going and they just look around. They don't even look at them anymore. You can have 10 monitors going. They don't look at them anymore.
It's funny you bring that up. We went to the, excuse me, the Pennsylvania show this year for the first time ever in Harrisburg. And of course, we didn't get the perfect booth space or anything, but we were by a lot of the outfitters, I guess, and kind of back in a corner. And the people that would come up, the people that knew us, that were following us, and there's a lot of them, you know, like, oh, well, that's that buck, that's that. And they knew their names, they knew everything and all that. But the vast majority of the people just funneling through, it's like you said, it's like they weren't even looking at, there was over 1,000 inches of bucks sitting on this display of these huge, wild, roaming deer that have been shot and documented in videos and this and that. And they're numb to it.
Yeah.
And I think it's because they were coming out of the outfitter building might have had something to do with it, you know, and so they were seeing all that. And then they came in, they assumed that we were an outfitter or whatever the case might be. But we got these two big monitors going. But like I said, the people that knew about what we were and who we were, you know, they were just all over. We had a great show. But that just kind of goes to what you're saying.
It was the same for us. I mean, when we first started doing shows and bringing a lot of these big bucks, you know, in replica form was the only way people could see them, because until Bass Pro got into the game, everything was tied up in private collections. They were in homes. Nobody could see these deer. So you'd see them in a magazine on the cover of North American Whitetail, and, you know, the person would say, wow, wow, wow. But now I'm the guy that's got them. You know, I got a 3-dimensional model of that thing at my booth in a beautiful display. And so in the first years of our booth, we got complaints. The show promoter would get complaints because the people were standing in the booths across the aisle to see our booth. They were standing there. That's how thick the crowd was around our booth.
Clogging it up.
Yeah, I mean, we had 50 or 75 feet, you know, with 15 giant heads. And, you know, they were standing, not doing business with those folks. They were standing in their booth to see ours. And, you know, if I wanted to get a hot dog, to get out of my booth was like fighting a crowd. You know, I was like this trying to get through the crowd. And I can come today with that same booth. I won't draw people like that anymore. They've seen this stuff. They've seen it. And, you know, it's time to repackage it and come out with a fresh new way of telling the same story or presenting the same product, you know. And that's a hard nut to crack.
And I think one of the most interesting things, I mean, you know, people coming to you, not only are they coming to you just to preserve their deer, but, you know, they can come and actually own, you know, a reproduction of some of those big deer, you know, the Jordan buck, those kinds of deer, and have them in their home. And I think one of the coolest things, and we touched on a little bit here, and like you said, there's a million more stories, but it's the stories behind those deer. You know, it's not just the look of them. We've all seen big deer. Yeah. Those deer are special. You talk about the hole in the horn buck. They're amazing. But, you know, once you hear some of the stories behind them, I think that's what really makes them, you know, stand out. You know, that's why I would love to have some of those deer in my home. Mm-hmm. But I think you're right on the money. It's the story behind those deer. It's not just that, yeah, they score 300 inches. It's the drama that happens behind it and the history that there's with every deer, whether it's the world record sheds or the world record deer. It's all about the story behind it, and that's the cool part about it.
Yeah, I remember the Jerry. What's his name again? Bryant, I think. Jerry Bryant, I believe is his name. Big Kansas deer, giant. What that thing go? 270s. Way up there, and he shoots this deer. He shoots it, and when he gets done shooting, he looks at his feet, and there are the sheds off that deer he just shot. Both sides laying there.
You gotta be
no
kidding
way.
me.
So, you know, he goes, look at that. And he picks them up. I mean,
talk about being in his bedroom.
Yeah,
no
I
kidding.
mean, it's just crazy stuff where you have, you know, just such neat stories and there's so many of them. I have to almost see the antler, and then all of a sudden, boom, all the stories come back, you know. Well, let me tell you about this one, you know. And and some have very uneventful stories, but some have incredible stories, you know, how they get discovered or how it got harvested, and, you know, it's like, man, that's one in a million, you know.
that, I just, this whole topic is exactly that's the trend we're going in. Now, I don't know what everybody else is going to do in this industry, but I'll be honest with you, and I'm not putting down anything or anybody, but the make it about the deer and not about yourself. And I promise you, the viral of the videos, we're doing it. And our numbers are, people don't believe me when I tell you what our numbers are. And I think that's where our industry needs to go.
Oh, I couldn't agree more with you. And I've said this, Pat and Nicole, good friends of mine. And I grew up with the Rick Whites, the Greg Millers, that whole bunch that I would consider pioneers of the industry when it comes to video hunting. They brought it to a whole new level. Then the guys running around with a VHS camera, filming out of the vehicle at night with a spotlight to see a big buck. They took it to that level. And I've always had conversations with them saying that, this industry has to reinvent itself all the time. And I couldn't agree more with you that's, focusing on the deer as the heroine of the story, the hero of the story, and, keeping that hunter. The hunter is part of the story, and it's always fun to hear that story from the hunter's mouth. There's no question of that. Johnny King is a good example. He's the most unassuming person you could ever meet. If you would say in a crowd, who shot this big buck? Johnny might go, it was me. Everybody, I did it. And he wouldn't. He's just not into any of the,
publicity.
Yeah, he wanted his deer to be, the number one when he found out what he found out about it, but it wasn't for his self. That I want my name in lights and everything. When you meet him, he's just the greatest guy, and that's true of most of them. They're very, very nice, humble people. And they just happen to harvest a big monster deer. But that's where I think the trend is going. I think you guys are onto something. I stumbled onto you guys one morning just watching YouTube, and the Deer Society came up. I said, Deer Society? Now, what's this all about? So I opened up some of the shows and watched them, and I was really impressed, and I liked the format because it was different. It wasn't this heart-pounding music, and our show features 27 explicit kills,
Yeah.
and the old advertisement.
Oh yeah, I know.
Hey, we got people out there that don't like what we do,
Yeah.
So it's nice to see that that's catching on, and I think that's the evolution of the business. It's going to move that direction, and people are going to tune in because they want to see that, rather than just another, kill shot and a rapid fire sequences. We're going to join so-and-so and he's going to kill one here, and join so-and-so and he's going to kill one there. The biggest departure from all that I stumbled on one day, we were at Deer Fest doing a show ourselves, and across the aisle from us were the folks that put together that series called Project Alaska. And I kept seeing the promo for that, these planes flying around and stuff, and kind of caught my curiosity. And I went over and I said, well, what is your show all about? And he told me, and I bought a copy of it. And I went home and I said, that's a show. Because it was an experience. It was a hunt. It was the challenge of going there with nothing more than a few spices and, the clothes on your back and the gear that you brought in. And, you only harvested 3 animals in the course of that 13 episodes. But I just was blown away because that, you felt like you were there.
Yeah.
You were there in Alaska hunting with them, and you had the bittersweet, experiences that they had. And I even liked a little bit of the brothers getting into it a little.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, you're getting a situation like that, it's going to be, that's real. That's how it really is. And it wasn't over dramatized like the Orange Chopper City thing where he's all ready to kill his son on camera for drama,
Right.
But it was just done very, very well and tastefully. And I actually got teary-eyed at the end of it when they slowed the cameras down. They didn't have any sound, and they reunited with their family and their kids at the airport. I thought that was really done well. Yeah, and it's just like, here's a big adventure, and we went out and we, exposed ourselves to potential dangers, and we set out to harvest these animals, and we lived off them, and it was just a great concept. And I think the viewing audiences out there are looking for that.
Yeah.
And that's
I got to agree. I'm going to step on you here, Brian,
Go ahead,
because that's not easy to do.
I know.
We've been doing video for a long time. We started out with a Panasonic little handy cam and filmed our first 200-inch deer, and I mean, like, oh my God, that's one thing.
Yeah.
But to tell those stories and to do that level of production, that is really hard to do. And it takes very talented people and special people to do that. And that's where we made the big step and the big commitment this year on the Deer Society of partnering with Brian and Adam specifically for that reason.
Yep.
So that we can jump that story to another level. And, then you're experiencing that emotion. The average guy can't do that. You can't go out and buy yourself a editing system and do the filming. I mean, you can't do that. You're seeing that on TV all day long.
Yeah.
And once again, I'm not bad-mouthing anything, but we're just going to go a different direction. And like I say, it's not easy, but we're going to make the commitment to do it.
Well, and there's such a fine line there, and Kiefer's do a great job. But, it's about bringing that real life situation into your home. You want to feel like you're there. So much in the past it's been, you see these guys shoot big deer, and that was cool, and it's great. I love watching people shoot big deer too. But when it comes down to it, nobody really cares, and they're not going to keep watching it just because they don't care if you shoot a big deer. They don't. They want to learn something, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the Deer Society has been built on, is education. So how do I shoot a big deer? That's what I want to know. But if you can take somebody and literally put them in the shoes of that person on the screen and capture that emotion, then, you have them hooked. That's what we want to hunt all year round. And, maybe we obviously can't hunt whitetails all year round or hunt elk or moose or these things. But if we can allow somebody to, in June, turn on the TV and, give them just even an ounce of that warm feeling, like, man, I feel like I was out there today, a little bit, then we've succeeded. And that's really the direction we're trying to go with it. Yeah.
And like you said, it's not about the hunt necessarily or the kill. You know what I mean? You watch that series, that show, and what they harvested 3 animals, but it was that story, that preparation, whatever. So things like, I don't need to just refer to our stuff, but like this podcast, for example, Whitetails from Scratch. Brian, your great video, that film that you did with, about your son, a letter to your son, and just those types of things, that's entertainment. I mean, and that's the trend that I think that we are headed and we need to do more of.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I heard a comedian the other night, and he said, you ever think we'd live in a time where there are thousands of channels and you sit down to watch TV and you can't find one you want to watch? And I said, that's me. That's me too. I sit there with the thing, not that, not this, not that. And I find myself watching old shows I've already watched because the new stuff, some of it, it's like, it's just another reality show. The other day I saw this young gal and she's, redoing homes, and how many do we have of those guys now out there, that are taking
whole network of them.
Old homes and
Right.
and transforming them. And so, what I've always had as a business philosophy for me is I look at what everybody else is doing and I run the other way. And I think you said that really well yourself in a different set of words, but it's not what everybody else is doing that's going to attract viewers. It's something new and fresh, and it's recycling something that's, it's been on the market for many years. This hunting thing has been around now for 30 years, filming and all this harvesting and stuff. And it's definitely taken it's gone down the point where the viewership is gone. I mean, look at the Outdoor Channel, all the changes there. I remember a time to get on the Outdoor Channel, you cut your arms off to get on there.
Yeah.
And now they're looking they're looking, begging for stuff.
Absolutely.
So it's greatly changed, but you have to have something fresh and new. And I think circling back is always the trend we see. Things cycle, and people get back to the grassroots of the whole thing. And I think that's where it's all heading. And those that are intuitive like yourselves, that see that trend and that sense that that's what people really want, you're going to get on the right side of it. And not that the other stuff was wrong, it's run its course.
Well, in wrapping up, I think it's all about, preserving the reason that we all started hunting in the first place and preserving our sport. And Klaus, what you do, thank you for what you do, because what you do is really preserve the heritage, the history that can't get lost. You preserve those deer and the memories, and everything is right there. I challenge everybody that might be listening to this, the next time you see a big deer, whether it be at a show or in Bass Pro or whatever, look at the deer for what it is. We all see the score, but I challenge you to look at and think about the history behind that deer. And it could be any deer, whether it's a big deer or a basket rack or any deer. Just take a minute to appreciate what that deer's life was like. And, don't look at it just for the hunter or the hunt. Look at it for the deer. Klaus, thank you very much. Check out antlersbyklaus.com. He does amazing work. You're truly an artist.
Well, thank you.
And make sure you subscribe to Deer Society YouTube. Check out the app if you haven't downloaded it yet. It's free. But I challenge you, take an extra minute, look at those deer, and really appreciate them for what they are.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike.
Boss.
Yeah.
Absolutely.